I need to be honest, for a long time, I simply stopped thinking about No Man's Sky. And I think that is exactly the right phrase. Stop thinking, because in my head, this game had already become one of those stories we tell as a warning, you know? Like, look at what happened to No Man's Sky whenever someone talks about an overhyped game. If you are over 25 and have been following games for a while, you remember the 2016 launch. An entire universe, infinite exploration, and multiplayer were promised, and what arrived was a much emptier and broken version of all that. I remember seeing people uninstall the game on the very day of release, and that stuck with me. After that, the lingering perception was that of a ghost game. You hardly saw anyone talking about it anymore, it didn't appear in what to play lists, and honestly, it felt like it had been simply forgotten by its own developer. This image of abandonment became so strong that it practically became common sense among gamers. And the worst part is that I bought into this narrative completely. I never went to check if it was still true. I just accepted that No Man's Sky was that game from the past, a scar on the industry, and went on with my life without questioning it. So I wonder, was I the only one still carrying this image frozen in time? Because apparently, many people also get stuck exactly at that point at the moment of launch without ever going back to see what happened afterward. And that is precisely where the story starts to get interesting. The first thing that caught me was right off the bat, even before I really started, the menu didn't look like the same game I remembered. The interface was cleaner, more modern, with many more options than before. It wasn't just an aesthetic change. You could feel there was much more under the hood. It was that kind of detail that plants it out in your head. Wait, this is too different. Then I got into the game, and a flood of systems started appearing that simply didn't exist in the version I had in my memory. Deeper base building, more structured missions, clearer progression systems, much more presence in NPC interaction. It seemed like every few minutes a new mechanic appeared that made me think, has this always been in the game? And clearly, no, all of that was built over time. The most curious thing is that it wasn't a gradual change in my perception. It wasn't like, oh, it improved a little. No, it was almost immediate. In less than an hour, that old image I had of the game started to completely dismantle. That feeling of emptiness, of lack of purpose, it simply wasn't there anymore. And there was a specific moment when it really clicked. I was exploring, managing resources, tracking objectives, thinking about what to do next. And I realized I was engaged, truly. It was no longer that somewhat mechanical and repetitive experience from the past. It was a game that was pulling me to continue. That was when I thought, without any exaggeration, I was completely wrong. It wasn't just a game that improved after launch. It was practically another game. And the most bizarre thing of all is realizing how long I stayed stuck on that first impression without ever giving it a second chance. When I started digging deeper for this video, I simply couldn't believe the amount of stuff added to No Man's Sky over these years. It wasn't one update here, another there. It was update after update, year after year, building something that today looks like a completely different game from the one that was released. And what's most impressive is that a good portion of this went unnoticed by those who, like me, simply stopped following it. Base building, for example, became a massive system. You can create complex structures, decorate them your way, set up automated mining operations, connect everything with electricity and internal logic. That would already be enough content for an entire game, but in No Man's Sky, it is just one layer among many others. Then comes the fleet and vehicle part, which also grew in an absurd way. You can command fleets of ships, send out expeditions, have specific ground vehicles for exploration, submarines to explore planet oceans. It's like the game kept gaining layer upon layer of things to do, and each of these layers seems to have received real attention. It's not just content thrown in there to fill space. And then there are the expeditions, which basically function as temporary events with their own objectives, exclusive rewards, and even specific narratives. This is the kind of thing that only exists in games being treated as something alive, in constant evolution, not as an abandoned project. Add to that the multiplayer, which today allows you to explore the universe with friends in a way that simply didn't exist before. And you start to understand the scale of the transformation. What struck me most, thinking about all this, is that this massive evolution happened almost in silence for a large part of the public. While the failed game narrative kept repeating itself out there, the developers simply kept working without stopping, delivering content after content. And it is surreal to think that I, someone who follows games closely, let a reconstruction of this size pass me by. Even with all this evolution, there is one thing No Man's Sky never lost. It is still a strange game. And I say this in the best possible sense. That feeling of landing on a planet and having no idea what you are going to find remains intact, and perhaps even stronger now with everything that has been added over time. The planets still manage to be unpredictable in a way few games do. Sometimes you arrive in a place that seems relatively normal, and suddenly the weather changes completely, or the terrain starts to reveal bizarre formations, or you realize that the planet has some peculiarity that totally changes how you explore. There is always something out of the ordinary, and the creatures, they remain a spectacle on their own. There are moments when you find species that seem even plausible, but right after, something completely absurd appears with strange proportions, unexpected behaviors, and combinations that only make sense within that universe. It is the kind of thing that makes each discovery feel unique, even after many hours. The landscapes also continue to carry that surreal air that marked the game from the beginning. Skies with improbable colors, vegetation that looks like it came out of a strange dream, entire planets that seem to have been created with their own rules. It is a type of aesthetic that does not try to be realistic, but rather memorable. And all this connects strongly to what I said before. This strangeness is not a flaw, it is one of the game's biggest attractions. Even after all the improvements, new systems, and additional content, No Man's Sky still revolves around this constant sensation of discovery. And perhaps that is precisely why it manages to remain so interesting after so long. If there is one thing that completely changed the way I see No Man's Sky, it wasn't just the game itself. It was what Hello Games did with it over the years. Because, being very direct, the easiest path there was to abandon the project, accept the image loss, and move on to something else. Many companies have already done exactly that in situations even smaller. But they did the opposite. Instead of disappearing, they kept working in silence, constantly updating the game, adding system after system, fixing problems, expanding the experience. And it wasn't for a few months, it was years of doing so. A level of persistence that honestly is rare to see in the industry. And the most impressive part, practically everything came as a free update. In an era where we are used to seeing paid DLC, expansions split into parts, and content being held back, No Man's Sky kept growing without charging those who had already bought the game back then, including those who joined during the worst phase. Over time, this started to have an effect. The community's perception began to change, little by little, without fanfare. It wasn't a sudden turnaround, it was a slow reconstruction of trust. Today, many people already look at the game with different eyes, not as that disaster from the launch, but as an example of recovery. And this raises an interesting reflection. How many studios would really be willing to do what Hello Games did? Because it is not just about fixing a game, it is about taking responsibility and continuing to deliver value even after the mistake. In the end, No Man's Sky ended up becoming not only a better game, but also one of the strongest examples of commitment to players that we have today. But at the same time, you cannot pretend that everything is perfect, because it isn't. Even with all this evolution, No Man's Sky still has some points that might push away certain players, especially depending on the type of experience you are looking for. The pace of the game, for example, continues to be slower and more contemplative. If you are the type of person who likes constant action, combat all the time, and fast progression, perhaps it won't hold you for very long. A large part of the experience still revolves around exploration, collection, and construction, and this naturally requires more patience. The learning curve can also be somewhat confusing at the beginning. The game has many interconnected systems, many mechanics that were added over the years, and not everything is explained in the clearest way possible. At times, you might get a bit lost trying to understand what to prioritize or how certain things work. And even with all the variety, there is indeed a certain level of repetition after many hours. exploring planets, collecting resources, upgrading equipment. This starts to follow a pattern. The difference is that now the game has more tools to break this repetition, but it can still appear depending on how much time you invest. No Man's Sky has evolved a lot, more than I imagined, but it still carries very specific characteristics that won't please everyone. And understanding this helps to better align the expectations of anyone thinking of playing it today. After playing Watch Dogs 2 in 2026, I leave with the feeling that this is, without a doubt, one of the Ubisoft games that aged the best. And a lot of that comes from the freedom it offers all the time. It's not just about completing missions, it's about how you choose to play, how you interact with the world, and how each small decision can completely change the experience. The open world continues to be one of the great highlights. Even today, it still feels more alive than many more recent games. And this isn't just because of the graphics, but because of the amount of systems working together, the NPCs reacting, the situations happening naturally. It's that type of game that makes you want to keep exploring without even noticing time passing. The narrative might divide opinions, mainly due to this more relaxed and even somewhat exaggerated tone at times. But at the same time, the themes remain extremely current. Privacy, technology, data control, all of this sounds even more relevant now than when the game launched. And even with technically more advanced games existing today, few manage to do something as fun as the hacking of Watch Dogs 2. And in the end, an almost inevitable reflection remains. Perhaps Watch Dogs 2 wasn't that bizarre when it came out. What is really bizarre is looking at 2026 and realizing that the world ended up becoming much more like it. And that's where the game stops being just an old game and becomes almost an unexpected portrait of the present.